to our Newman Night. Certainly, Reza Aslan's book, Zealot, has created quite an interest. And you've got to seize the moment of interest, because we always got to look and look again, look for new insights. And we have here an incredibly wonderful person to do that. Where's our student leader? This is our go-to.
Okay, thank you, Father. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elisa, and I'm a junior here at Stanford. I'm on the Catholic leadership team in charge of faith formation, so Newman Nights is one of our biggest events. And you'll have to excuse me, I've been pretty sick, so my voice is kind of gross at the moment. But if you have your John Henry Newman prayer card, we'll start with our prayer. And if you don't have it, just close your eyes, pray how you like. Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Jesus, flood my soul with thy spirit and life. Penetrate and possess my whole being so utterly that all my life may only be a radiance of thine. Stay with me, and then I shall begin to shine as thou shinest, so to shine as to be a light to others. Let me preach thee without preaching, not by words, but by my example, by the catching force of the sympathetic influence of what I do, the evident fullness of the love my heart bears to thee. Amen. So tonight, Dr. Murphy will be presenting on Empires, Kingdoms, and Zealots, How Political Was Jesus of Nazareth? So Professor Catherine Murphy received a BA in History from Santa Clara University, a Master's in Catechetics from Santa Clara University, and her Master's and PhD in New Testament and Early Christianity from the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Her research explores the interplay between religious ideologies and economic practices in Judaism and Christianity at the turn of the era, from 100 BCE to 200 CE. In her teaching and research, she uses insights from post-colonial theory and gender studies to imagine the ancient context and contemporary receptions of biblical texts. And Father Xavier actually informed me before this, a little fun fact, she actually wrote The Historical Jesus for Dummies. You know, those informative books, which is a book that I personally would love to read, so maybe you can point us in the direction of that after. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Murphy.
Well, hello, and I want to really thank you for welcoming me here tonight. We had a few technical glitches at the beginning, and so I have to plug one more thing in here, and we will keep our fingers crossed that it won't throw everything off. Okay, I think we're good. All right, I wanted to title this talk about Empires, Kingdoms, and Zealots because of the release of this book by Reza Aslan, who, by the way, is a graduate of our Religious Studies Department at Santa Clara University. This book is Zealot, and I wonder before we get started if any of you have gotten a copy and or have read it. Any show of hands, anyone who's read it? Haven't read it yet, but you've gotten a copy. A couple of you have read it, though? A couple have. You're just started. Okay. So what are your impressions before we get started? I'd like to know my audience a little bit before I launch into my views. But really, what you've read some of it. What I was listening to you discussing this with the people around you earlier. What is your view of it?
Well, I mean, obviously, he doesn't believe that Christ is the Son of God. He believes that he was divinely inspired, I think, and I think that comes from his Islamic background, because Muslims believe that Jesus Christ was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, prophet.
Yeah, Muhammad probably tops him,
but Muhammad never performed miracles.
No, that's right. They were
And
always a little
Jesus
sensitive
did,
about
and
that.
They believed that he did, and they also believed in Mary, and that she was a virgin. And if you go to the Middle East, both our parents are from Lebanon. We're Christians. Mm-hmm. But if you go to the Harissa, which is a hill overlooking Beirut with the Virgin Mary, you go there on a Sunday, 75-80% of the people there are Muslim. And they're asking for favors, you know, they want children, women, who are barren, etc. And if you go to Sigmea or Malula in Syria, which were great Christian shrines, Muslims go there to pray. So I have a feeling that that influenced him a great deal on his take of who Jesus was. That
Yeah,
he was
certainly,
something of a prophet, but not the Son of God.
Certainly, one of the main things about the picture of Jesus in Islam is that he's only a prophet. So on that score, there's a real similarity. But there's a real divergence between his portrait of Jesus and another important picture of Jesus that emerges in the Quran. In the Quran, in Surah 4, it says that Jesus only appeared to be crucified, but he wasn't crucified and he didn't die. Well, Jesus' crucifixion is central to this book. The fact that he was killed by Rome is central to Aslan's portrait that Jesus was a political rebel. So on that score, he's really divergent from mainstream Islam in the portrait of Jesus. Has anyone else read the book yet? Yeah.
I mean, I'm about 2/3 of the way
Yeah.
through, so like, I guess I don't put it, does that count? Or,
It does, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be done with probably this week because I was just so curious. I heard an NPR interview with him earlier this summer. It was pretty extreme. It was very good. And so far, you don't need to read the book to listen to the NPR interview. But
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
There was an NPR interview, and it was very comprehensive. And so I was really drawn in by it. I'm getting my PhD in literature here, so I'm very
okay.
interested in. I also do a lot of intellectual history because I study the Renaissance and the Baroque.
Okay.
So I have to live outside of my own time frame, and like in the same way that you do. Well, it's a little closer to ours. What took me in it was his assertion about the issue of genre, simply that the Gospels were not written to as historical factoids, and so we can't project a lot of our same expectations that we would onto like some sort of a historical text, much like his own, onto the Gospels, hoping that they somehow give us back what we want out of them. In the same way that we don't do it with the book of Genesis. I don't know how, like there are some people who read it in a literal sense, but others who don't. And I think that was one of the great contentions he makes in the book. I mean, that's actually not something he trumps up a lot, but there's a few paragraphs in there where he makes a very good case for that early in the book. The second thing he talks about that I think, well, he does this throughout the entire book, is he has to fill in a lot of gaps. He's honest about having to fill in a lot of gaps, saying that I don't know any of this, and we don't know how reliable the Gospels are, and so I have to fill in a lot of gaps. And so he does a lot of like really broad brushstrokes about the historical context in which Jesus found himself. To what extent that's accurate or not is another story. I don't know. Like he doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about Pontius Pilate, for example. So he kind of does like a smear campaign of him, which I found interesting. And so I mean I know I'm kind of rambling here, but one thing I've noticed about the argument is very facile. He really kind of takes you in a direction where he's sort of pushing Jesus away from this sort of pacific person that we came to know him as this extreme political radical. And the thing is, I'm very much wrapped into this argument right now. I'm just like, yeah, I see what he's saying, you know.
And we want it to be true. We want him to be this relevant political activist.
And so I'm just like, really, like this is very facile because I feel myself being torn away. I feel myself being torn in that direction. So like, not saying that I am, but I'm just saying like it leads me to, it gives me that strong inclination. So those are a few impressions that I've got.
Well, I think a few others of you have read it, but we might just table those further additional comments to when we move into small group discussion, and you can share your impressions if you've actually read the book with each other. What I'd like to do with you tonight is to take a look at the thesis of the book and look at a few of the elements of it. I want to first discuss the kind of just the basic ideas that he presents in the book. And then I want to criticize them because I'm an historical Jesus scholar myself. And I want to kind of point out maybe some of the lacks in his argument. You're quite right that it's typical when dealing with somebody this ancient, 2,000 years ago, for whom we have many sources, much more than you would think for someone of that social class from 2,000 years ago. But we only have so many sources, and they're very biased in his favor. There's going to be a lot of gaps, a lot of questions we have that all of us have to either acknowledge, or if we're writing a novel, fill in. Otherwise, it won't read at all. And so he is honest about wanting to do that, but we have to look at how he's doing it and how certain he is of his results, I think. So his thesis in a nutshell, for those of you who haven't read the book. Jesus was a nationalist Jew who advocated a political rebellion against Rome. So he wanted to overthrow the Romans. Like other messiahs, and Aslan points to a lot of different messiahs from the period, or figures that he deems to be messiahs, his movement mobilized the peasants who Aslan presents and some other scholars present as a really oppressed group, particularly up in the region where Jesus grew up. That's the Galilee in the northern part of Israel. So the picture he draws of that region is that there's been increasing concentration of wealth, that this has impoverished more and more of the peasantry, and that as a result, they're inclined to join in movements led by political leaders who want to help them remove the shackles and improve their economic circumstances. Now, as part of this picture of an economic oppression, Aslan pulls in what's going on in the Jerusalem temple down in the south. Another whole part of the country then from where Jesus grows up. There's a temple there, the central shrine for the Jews. Jews occasionally go there, some probably more than others. They go there for annual festivals. And there are certain obligations when they go there to pay money for animals and other goods to sacrifice. Aslan portrays that system of what's going on in the temple as rapacious, as gouging people, as taking their money, as something that they wanted to overthrow as well. And certainly Jesus he places in this camp. Jesus is someone who wants to overthrow not only the Romans, but also the people running the temple. He presents the people running the temple, that is, the highest aristocrats in Jerusalem, Jewish aristocrats, high priests, as being in league with the Romans. And that's very much true. In fact, in the period of Jesus' adulthood, whoever the prefect was appointed by Rome, the local governor who governed the region around Jerusalem, that person, that Roman, got to pick who the high priest was. So the Romans would only pick a high priest who was willing to collaborate with them. So the leading aristocrats of the temple, if they were going to stay in power, needed to work with Rome. So this picture we get of the leadership of the temple working in league with Rome is accurate. The other piece of this, though, is that the temple is all about basically taking people's money, and that many Jews were crushed by the sort of burden of these tithe payments and sacrificial payments into the temple coffers. And another part of his thesis is this notion that when Jesus failed, right? Because if he was all about a political rebellion, but he ends up the one crucified, failure, right? He doesn't achieve that political aim. And so his disciples, who in Aslan's view did experience something at the resurrection, though he's cautious about how to talk about that, that they changed sort of their tune, and instead of being fearful, they went out and sort of changed the Jesus they preached to the one that they experienced after the resurrection. Of course, Aslan's kind of cautious about how he talks about that. But the Jesus that they preach is a more celestial being, that the disciples are worried about presenting Jesus as a political rebel, because if they present him that way, they'll draw the wrong kind of attention from Rome. They'll get crucified like Jesus did. And this becomes more important after about 40 years after Jesus' death, when the Jews rise up in a revolt against Rome as a whole country. And gradually, over 3-4 years, that's crushed. And as a result, the Romans humiliate the Jews. They take many of them to Rome and march them through the streets in a triumph. They portray the goods, the spoils they took from the Jerusalem temple in the arch that's still there in the Forum. You can still see it. And they're out to get Jewish people. They're not happy with the losses that they incurred in Palestine, and so they start taxing the Jews more heavily wherever they live in the empire. And Aslan views that moment as one when Christians had to decide, are we with the Jews or are we going to break away? Are we going to differentiate ourselves? And in his view at that moment, Christians begin to really differentiate themselves more than they had before, and turn Jesus into an apolitical figure under the pressure of this new circumstance, trying to live in the Roman Empire. Okay, makes sense? For those of you who've read that, does that sound like a good summary of kind of hit some of his basic points? Okay, so now you don't have to read it. No. Go ahead, buy it, read it. All right, but I would like to talk with you about how persuasive this is, because that's our topic tonight. And I will take issue with some of what he says. And by the way, I did this personally with him. He came to Santa Clara. We had a panel. I sent him all these comments that I'm sharing with you tonight, so he's seen them. I'm not trying to do something behind his back here. The first point I'd like to make is that his thesis is not a new one. The idea of presenting Jesus as a political figure is as old as the historical Jesus quest itself. The first quester after the historical Jesus, Herman Samuel Reimarus, didn't even publish his ideas in his own lifetime because he was fairly certain what would happen to him if he did. He was a theologian, right? Kind of lose your job if you start saying that Jesus isn't a religious figure, he's a political figure. But that was his thesis, that Jesus was the advocate of a failed revolution, that he was all about changing the politics of his time. And when he failed, his disciples were so disappointed that in Reimarus' view, and Reimarus goes farther than Aslan here, in Reimarus' view, the disciples made up the resurrection. They invented it out of whole cloth. They tried to pull one over on the people they preached to in order to save face. They made up the resurrection, and they made up a more celestial Jesus. So this was one of the earliest questers in the whole historical Jesus quest. As I said, he didn't publish his ideas in his lifetime. Another gentleman did, and he lost his job for doing it. So you can see that people were taking this very seriously at the time. Another thinker who also advocated a sort of political Jesus was Albert Schweitzer, the great medical doctor. He was also a theologian. And in his studies of the historical Jesus, he imagined that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher, very much in the vein that Aslan does. If you've ever read Aslan's other books, his fascination has always been with apocalyptic. He presented Islam in that vein. In looking in his book Beyond Fundamentalism, or How to Win a Cosmic War, he was interested in the sort of language of apocalyptic war that we're engaged in the battle between Islam and Christianity. And so he wants to tone down the rhetoric. But here, when he turns to Jesus, he wants to ramp up the rhetoric. He imagines Jesus, like Schweitzer did, as an apocalyptic preacher, someone who saw the end of time coming at any moment, a major transformation, and that transformation was in part political. Now, Schweitzer wouldn't say that the disciples totally made up a celestial Jesus, but he would say that Jesus failed, that his mission was about preaching the kingdom of God, and that preaching failed. It never came. It never started. So Schweitzer and Reimarus are both seeing Jesus as a Jew, placing him in that first century context, and when they look at him, they see someone who can only be understood and is only relevant in that circumstance, in that century. Because he preached something that never happened, how can he be relevant for us now? And I pose that question to you to begin thinking about, because ultimately it's a question we might ask Reza Aslan if he were here. You might think about whether it matters. If Aslan is right that Jesus was just a political preacher, and he failed in his attempt to overturn Rome, then why is anyone following him at all? Keep that in the back of your minds. I'd be interested to kind of wander around and hear your discussions in small group. Another person who advocated Aslan's thesis before he did was S.G.F. Brandon, who in 1967, interesting period of time to do this, wrote a book called Jesus and the Zealots, in which he first floated the idea, not just that Jesus was a political revolutionary, but that he showed some similarities with this group of people, partisans really, guerrilla warriors, who rise up around the time of maybe 30 years after Jesus. We hear about them in a Jewish historian named Josephus, who writes a little bit after that major revolt. And all of this is about 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death. So these zealots are actually later first century. They are political rebels. They lead the Jewish revolt against Rome. And Brandon was curious whether it's best to understand Jesus' political aims in light of these zealot groups. At the end of the day, he's careful, like Aslan is, to recognize that that group is a group we don't hear about until 20 or 30 years after Jesus' death. Nobody talks about them in the early part of the century when Jesus was alive. So Brandon will be a little more careful than Aslan in saying that Jesus might have kind of tapped into the same wellspring of discontent, but he won't call him a zealot. As you know, Aslan does. And he starts his book, did those of you who've read it notice? He starts his book not with Jesus' birth or his adulthood like the Gospels do. He starts his book in the Jewish revolt, in the middle part of the century, 20 or 30 years after Jesus' death. He starts it there so that he can set up a very volatile sort of political circumstance, which we know was true starting in the 50s and moving into the 60s. And then he goes back in time to Jesus to read Jesus through those events. Now, ultimately, that's a little anachronistic. Ultimately, That's like saying something that happened 40 years after a guy's death influenced him when he was alive, right? So there's a chronological problem with that sort of argument. And Brandon was more careful about making it. He never quite said, and even Aslan steps back off outright saying that Jesus was one of this party, because we know the party didn't exist during his lifetime. So I've already kind of hinted at some of the problems that I see anyway with this thesis, things I've shared with Reza himself. The first point I'd like to make, and I'll just kind of mention these in sequence. Aslan depends on a view of the northern part of the country that imagines it as volatile and economically oppressed, so there's a whole population of poor people who are experiencing worse and worse life circumstances and are ready to be mobilized at the drop of a hat if the right person comes along. So this is the picture he gives. The problem is our archaeological evidence doesn't support that picture in the first part of the century. Now, granted, we haven't dug up all of Galilee. We've only dug up a village here, there, elsewhere. We've dug up some of the routes, like the roads, that connected some of these villages. The picture that archaeologists in the Galilee are giving us is that during Jesus' lifetime, what we see is increased signs of prosperity. We see more roads connecting villages, which suggests greater commerce. We don't see large homes expanding in size, which you will sometimes see in a period of debt servitude, right? When the wealthy are, loaning money out, people can't pay it back, so they have to sell their whole farm in order to cover the cost. And so the wealthy gain that extra money, expand their homes into large estates. We're living in a part of the world where that's happening all the time. People are tearing down their neighbors' homes to build their mega mansions. You know what we're talking about. You'd expect there to be archaeological evidence of houses getting bigger, and we haven't found it yet. It doesn't mean it can't be there, we just haven't found the picture that a lot of folks are saying must be there. It isn't. So you're not seeing debt servitude or the sort of echoes of that, the fingerprints of that. You're seeing increased commerce. You're seeing the building of several large cities, which might have funneled some of the local produce into those cities and increase the take that the wealthy were taking off of the imports and exports and the trade duties that they were collecting. But that circumstance increases the amount of arable land. We see more farms going into production, small farms, large farms. So it looks like a picture of prosperity in the early part of the century. It's not until later in that period, not until the mid part of the century, that things start to get a little dicey up there. And this corresponds with some of what we know politically is going on. During Jesus' lifetime, the northern region where he grew up is run by a Jewish client king, the son of Herod the Great, one of his sons. He had like 10 wives and multiple sons, and those that survived him, he killed many of his own sons because he worried about them taking over. Those that survived him, a couple of them got to inherit his land, his kingdom. They split it into 4 parts. The son who got Jerusalem got the best part of all, but it was the most volatile part down there because it was the center of the country, the center of its heritage. And in the year 6, maybe about 10 years after Herod the Great dies, in the year 6 CE, Common Era, so like about 10 years after Jesus' birth, in that year, he can't manage it anymore. He can't control it. He can't control it to Rome's satisfaction. So Rome kicks him out down in Jerusalem and puts a prefect in, one of their own guys governing the whole place down in the south. They don't find the need to do that up in the north. That son, they leave him on the throne. He's doing just fine. He's able to manage things, keep the peace, take out any threats, do everything for Rome, pay his gifts to Rome, pay his taxes to Rome that he's collecting from all those people. There's peace up there. There's not the instability we see in the south. So the picture we get during Jesus' life is stable north, unstable south. So this thesis that Galilee was so oppressed during Jesus' life and that he mobilized the peasantry behind him, I don't see the evidence. There are scholars who Aslan is reading, he is reading people and citing their work in his notes, who think there was all this turmoil going on up there. But they aren't the archaeologists. They're social scientists who study how empires work today in the modern world. And they imagine that if they work this way now, they must have worked that way then. If we have oppressed peasantry now rising up in revolt, that must have been the case in this imperial circumstance back in the Mediterranean. So they're taking a model, an analogy from an empire and applying it to Jesus' world. That's less secure, isn't it, than archaeological evidence? Now again, our picture may change, I'll be the first to admit, if we unearth the right stuff and get a different picture. But right now, we don't have the evidence to support the modeling that our social scientists expect. So I'm persuaded more by the physical evidence, at least right now. Second thing, he depends on a view of the temple that's very negative, Aslan does, imagining that that's what Jesus was targeting, that and Rome. But our Gospels don't seem to share that view. Now, granted, they're written after Jesus' death. There's all kinds of time for our authors to change their tune about things like the temple or even Jesus, for that matter. There's been decades that have passed for them to reflect on Jesus or reflect on the temple and change sort of how they present those. But by the time all our authors are writing, the temple's destroyed. It's gone now. It's been destroyed by the Romans in that revolt. It's just not there. So you would think that they wouldn't necessarily need to present it in a positive light. They do. Jesus worships there. Even after that scene where Jesus marches into the temple and knocks over the tables of the money changers, even after that scene, Jesus goes back to the temple and teaches in it the next day. If we are to believe Acts of the Apostles, the disciples, the followers of Jesus, keep going there after his death. They keep working there. If they were so opposed to the temple, why do they keep going? And also, when Jesus goes into the temple in that famous scene in Mark and Matthew and Luke, and overturns all of the tables of the money changers, it says he also overturns he knocks over the buyers. That's the average people, not the people profiting from the sale of animals, but the people there to buy their animals for their sacrifices. If Jesus is all about attacking those in power, he should only be attacking their tables and not knocking everybody out of the picture. Whatever's going on in that scene, I'm not sure it's best described as an attack on the temple itself. So that doesn't seem to be the target of Jesus. I'd say one or two more things about that, but let's move on. The temple is an interesting target of attention in the Gospels because just, of course, right when they're writing their Gospels, it's just been destroyed. And in the, let's say, 70, 80 years, actually more like 90 or 100 years, before it's destroyed, during Jesus' lifetime, before his lifetime, and immediately after, the Jewish king, Herod the Great first, and then others, had built this thing out into a beautiful sort of centerpiece of religious worship in the ancient world. People were coming from all over the Mediterranean to worship here. And I'm not just talking Jews. One of the major, largest courtyards at the top of the platform there behind the stoa, the colonnades up on the perimeter, is a temple of the court of the Gentiles where anybody could go and worship and offer sacrifice. It was a showcase. It was a place where people could gather. It wasn't just a dinky podunk temple out in the middle of nowhere like it had been before Herod got his hands on it. Herod, working in league with the Romans, had benefited a lot from that relationship, had gotten very wealthy, and he spent a lot of that money on public buildings like the temple. And this became a go-to spot for Gentiles and Jews around the Mediterranean. You can see how amazing it is. I mean, if you've ever visited Jerusalem, anyone? Anyone ever been there to the Western Wall? A couple people? Mm-hmm. And you ever get close to this wall? This is the Western Wall here. Actually, the part that's exposed now, if you ever visit, is like the ground level's here. So you usually see this part of the wall. These stones are like at least as big as that column laying sideways, right, making up the courses of the wall. They're huge and heavy. It would have taken a lot of engineering and a lot of money to build that. That's Herod's legacy. And it's such a powerful construction engineering feat that most of the base is still there. So there had been a lot of effort put into this temple, and yet when our Gospels write their stories, it had just been destroyed. It had just been decimated. So it's interesting to imagine that the temple, in Aslan's view, the temple is a target of Jesus, when in fact it seems like he just kept worshiping there even after that scene when he loses his temper. Not to mention that in one of the Gospels, Jesus does that scene of knocking over the tables when he first visits Jerusalem 3 years before he dies. It has about as much to do with why he's arrested as I don't know what else. That isn't the reason he's arrested, whereas it is in a couple of the Gospels. So there's, the evidence is hard to read here, and I don't think it's fair to read it as an institution that was basically stealing from people, that was taking all their money from them. In fact, I think this plays into anti-Jewish stereotypes, and I would think a Christian scholar for sure, and I would hope a Muslim scholar would be sensitive to that legacy of Christian charges of the greediness and stinginess of Jewish leaders, especially when there's really no necessity for imagining it, given that Jesus, remember that story where he praises a woman, a poor woman, who just gives a couple coins to the temple? He praises her for having given so much of what she has. Well, why would he do that if he thought the temple was stealing from poor people like her? Why would he praise her for what she did? It just doesn't square. So again, I'm not persuaded by this image. A third problem. Aslan makes a lot of the fact that Jesus was crucified, and he's right that that's one of the incontrovertible facts about Jesus. We have testimony about it from a Roman historian as well as from the Christian Gospels. So we have a lot of evidence that this happened. It's also a very awkward thing to admit that your leader that you follow failed so miserably and suffered such an ignoble death. So I would agree with him that we absolutely have to recognize that Jesus was crucified and understand the significance of that. For Aslan, the significance of the crucifixion is that it's reserved for threats to Rome who are political rebels. And the charge over Jesus' head, King of the Jews, meant that Jesus was a messianic figure, that he embraced that identity, that he advocated violent rebellion, and the Romans read him right when they saw him as a political threat. I don't know that, my view is that crucifixion doesn't require that the Romans be completely right. It doesn't require that Jesus be a rebel. It just requires that the Romans would have perceived him to be a threat. And a threat not in terms of him so much, but a threat in terms of the Jewish crowd. They're the threat. If the Jewish crowd somehow sympathizes with Jesus or imagines he might be some sort of leader against Rome, if there's even a hint that that might be the way the crowd is going, that's when Rome will take him out. It almost doesn't matter what Jesus himself taught. What matters is how the crowd perceived Jesus. You see, because if Jesus was just a political threat, and certainly if he was higher class, he could have just been executed. They could have just stabbed him or cut his head off. You only crucify for a couple of reasons. The political threat to Rome, yes. But you crucify low-class people, not high-class people, because it's a slow way to die. It's painful and it's humiliating. You're stripped naked, you're impaled on something, usually right at the city gate. Everybody watches you die as they come in and out of the city. Birds eat at you, dogs eat at you while you're dying, and you die slowly by asphyxiation. It usually takes a couple of days. And the Romans were doing this all the time. So it's a death that's reserved for low-class people. It's also a death you reserve when it's the crowd you want to teach. When it's the people coming into the city past that gate that you want to send the signal to. It's like a big billboard about who's in charge, right? So it does signal something to us about Jesus's, if you will, maybe popularity on a certain level. That the Romans were concerned the crowd could turn for him. So it does seem to suggest there could have been a following, that maybe there was a following, or at least that Rome was concerned about that happening. So to some extent, I would agree with Aslan that the crucifixion points us in a political direction, and we need to take that more seriously than Christians sometimes have. But again, Rome wouldn't need the man himself to say it. All they would need is for the crowd to start talking about it. That would be enough of a pretext to take Jesus out. Another thing that Aslan will say is that, of course, if you want to present Jesus as a political rebel who advocates violence and wants to overthrow the Romans, you have a difficult, you have to deal with the passage where it says that Jesus preached loving your enemies, because it would seem to suggest that he wasn't advocating violent attacks on his enemies. So Aslan argues that away by saying that the enemies that Jesus is talking about are the enemies among his fellow Jews, not external enemies. And he says that his basis for that is a quotation from an earlier Jewish book, Deuteronomy, where it says that you shall slay all the foreigners in your midst. As if all Jews in all times took that literally. As if every Jew's attitude towards every foreigner was always that you had to slay them. He has to argue it that way in order to allow that enemy can't be the Romans. I just think that's special pleading. It's not persuasive to me. I think that the teaching about loving your enemies is probably one of the most historical things Jesus said. For reasons I'll explain in a minute, one of the criteria scholars use for assessing whether something Jesus said or did is historical is how awkward it is, how difficult, how unusual. If we never hear anyone else saying this, and it's also really difficult to do, scholars tend to favor a saying like that as likely to have been spoken by him. It's not very hard to say love your enemy Jews. It's a lot harder to say love your enemy Romans. And so most scholars that I'm aware of read love of enemies as loving the Romans, not your fellow Jews. So that presents some problems here for his thesis too. Remember the idea that when Jesus is, thank you. Actually, no, that's fine, thanks. That after Jesus dies, the disciples make Jesus over, do a big makeover, and make him into this celestial, sort of angelic sort of figure. He becomes a heavenly being because, obviously he didn't make it as a politician. He didn't succeed. So they make him over into a celestial person. They take him out of this world. They make him an otherworldly entity. And Aslan's evidence of that is how they start to talk about him as the Son of God. I want to take a moment with that notion, because in my view, from the reading I've done in Roman political theology at the first century, when you call Jesus Son of God, it actually, in the Roman context, it actually makes him more political, not less, in their world. Now, I'll grant you, for us, a rebel Jesus sounds like he's an activist. We can understand that. He's not doing miracles. He's doing all the things we recognize and get. So we can grab onto that kind of Jesus. And the minute you start calling him Son of God or Heavenly Agent or Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, we think, oh, pie in the sky, opiate of the people. This is, not a Jesus we can believe in. But it sounded completely different in the first century. And I wanted to show you some illustrations to make the point. Remember that Jesus is born right around the beginning of the Roman Empire. This is a coin that Augustus, the first long-term Roman emperor, cuts. Just wait for the ringing to be done. And it's got his uncle, Julius Caesar, the first emperor, right? His uncle who was assassinated because he had violated the principles of Republican Rome in assuming all power into himself as the first emperor. So many of the other senators were upset with him taking all that power, and they assassinated him. Well, pretty soon after, his adopted nephew, Augustus, Octavian, actually becomes the emperor himself. And he manages to keep the peace and also promote his own power. And one of the first things he does is he hosts games in honor of his uncle. And during these games, think like the Olympics, the 7-day run of games. During these games in Rome, a comet just happens to appear in the sky. And it's so bright that it's visible during the day. And it lasts for the whole duration of the games. Well, Augustus reads this astral phenomenon as not only evidence that his uncle should be deified, but he reads the comet as his uncle, right? This comet in the sky is sort of his uncle divinized and returned to sort of oversee the games in his honor. So he mints this coin with Caesar Augustus himself on one side, and on the back side, this is the comet, a stylized comet, and in the middle of the coin it says, Divine Julius. Right? So he's imagining his uncle as divine. It goes even further, though, in coins that Augustus mints for himself. Here he has his bust on the one side again, and on the back side we have a figure of Pax or Peace, the famous Roman peace that he brought to the Roman Empire by quelling all the civil wars and other battles. We have peace holding a cornucopia, the symbol of abundance, and also an olive branch, the symbol of peace. And notice the inscription around the coin. Caesar, Divi Filius, the F is for Filius, Caesar, son of God. Caesar, Augustus, is calling himself son of God. It's a political title he's assuming for himself, among others. And so when we hear the early Christians using that term for Jesus, we need to hear the political radicalness of that. It's not making Jesus some otherworldly being. It's making Jesus like the emperor. And within about, let's say, 30 years of our Gospels making those claims, we have evidence of a Roman up in Turkey who is arresting, he's a governor, he's arresting Christians because they won't worship the emperor. And he finds out after he tortures some of the deaconesses that the reason they won't worship the emperor is that they're believing in Jesus as if he were God. So the significance of that in this context is, because they believe Jesus is Son of God, it has political implications for them. They can't worship the emperor because they understand worship of Jesus to be exclusive. They can only worship him. Does this make sense? And so they aren't going to pour out libations. They're going to get tortured. They're going to get killed. So there's very real-world implications for the language. So calling Jesus Son of God doesn't necessarily make you less political. What it really means is that Augustus has been replaced by Jesus. That's an artist's rendition based on computerized skulls of first century Palestinian men trying to figure out what a first century Palestinian man like Jesus would have looked like. So in this context, Jesus replaces Augustus. And one last thing about the book. It doesn't ever really tell you why certain things are more persuasive than others. He has all these footnotes that maybe argue some of it. But scholars who are trying to reconstruct what Jesus did and said, they have to be a little more careful, or they tend to be a little more careful and tell you what they're looking at that persuades them. So there are certain rules they're working with, and I've mentioned a couple of them already. When scholars look at a gospel or any other biased source of evidence, they're more likely to think something happened in the story if, first of all, it's in the story and not something no one ever talked about, like Jesus is a political rebel advocating violence. If it's eyewitness or at least early testimony, like if we have some early texts that say it. If it's embarrassing, like the crucifixion of Jesus itself, that's a difficult thing that they can't not talk about. And so if you tell something that works sort of against you, makes your work harder, and you're still willing to say it, that seems to argue to scholars that it likely happened. They're going to look to see that the evidence is reported in independent witnesses, as many as possible. They're going to want sayings of Jesus that sound like something a first century Palestinian preacher with very little education might have said. Short, pithy sayings, parables and riddles, the ways we know people of the time talked and preached and spoke. If there's other evidence from Palestine, from Rome, from the Jews, and so on, that gives us a picture of what's going on, like our archaeological evidence in the Galilee, that tells us there's prosperity and not economic turmoil, then we're looking for evidence that coheres with that picture. If it diverges a lot, it makes it less likely. If something plays into beliefs we know to be later Christian beliefs, if, for example, there's all of this, Jesus does something and our gospel author tells us all of this happened to fulfill prophecies, we tend to suspect that that's a later addition because it's people later adding their interpretations to something. So if we're trying to get to the historical Jesus, we strip that sort of interpretation out. And then lastly, the picture we develop ultimately does have to cohere with the fact that he was crucified. Now that's probably in a way the strength of Zealot, the strength of this book, because he focuses everything around that moment, focus everything around Jesus' crucifixion. And a portrait of Jesus as a political rebel would definitely lead to crucifixion. It's just that it doesn't cohere with some of the other things we think were historical in the text. Things like love of enemies, things like other plausibility issues. For example, if Jesus was a political rebel and that was core of his teaching, you presume that he preached that all along, right? So when he was up in the Galilee, he would have been preaching it, right? He would have been gathering his band of men and they would have been advocating violence. So why didn't the Jewish client king up there arrest him and kill him? Shouldn't he have? I mean, and we know he was an effective client king, that he would do that sort of thing for a couple of reasons. One is he got to be king for so long. The Romans didn't replace him because he was effective. Another proof of it is he did take out John the Baptist. And Josephus, our Jewish historian from that period, tells us the reason he took him out, the reason he arrested and killed him, was too many people were gathering around him. He was drawing too big of a crowd. And Herod Antipas in the north thought, oh, that crowd could turn against me and Rome at any minute. I'm just going to arrest him and nip it in the bud so it can't go that far. If Jesus was advocating violence, Herod would have taken him out too. He arrests John the Baptist for a lot less, just for having a crowd. So it doesn't sort of ring true. Also, if Jesus' followers were being trained for an armed revolt, why didn't the Jewish authorities and Pilate also arrest them? Why only go after the ringleader? If what they were doing was preparing for a revolt, not just talking about it, but getting ready to do it, then those men are as much of a threat as Jesus. But they're never attacked. In fact, according to our early Christian testimony, they stay in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's the danger spot, right? I mean, the Romans have their capital a little further away, but they know that's the ancestral capital. If the Christians want to be safe, they're going to run away from there and hide out in the caves like the Zealots do later in the century, but they don't. They stay right there. They'd be a living target if the Romans had any sense that that's what they're about. So the sort of plausibility issue, it kind of rears its ugly head here. And I just, in the end of the day, I'm not totally persuaded by the argument. And I'm aware that we're probably almost out of our time before the small group discussion. So maybe just let me make one last comment about what Jesus did preach. And this will be things that sort of do agree with some of what Aslan says. Most historical Jesus scholars do believe that not only was Jesus crucified, so that would suggest some sort of political content to at least the threat of Jesus, if not what he's taught. But they'll go further and say that when we look at what he taught, one of the themes that appears all over the place, that probably is historical, is that he did preach the kingdom of God. Now the question then is, what is that kingdom, if it's not the sort of outright violent political kingdom that Aslan's talking about? But why we think it's historical? It's in the earliest sources we have. I've put them in parentheses, but that doesn't matter so much. Our earliest witnesses mention it. It's embarrassing because it didn't happen. Maybe it started, but it didn't finish. It's in all kinds of different material, not just various sources by different authors who aren't aware of each other's work, but also in various literary genres within the Gospels. There are different types of material, and scholars like John Meyer, who's an historical Jesus scholar, they look at this to see how many sort of fingerprints has this tradition left, and if it's sort of all over the place, you see it everywhere, that suggests that it's an early part of the tradition that makes its way as the tradition develops into all parts of the tradition. So it suggests that it is early. So some of the forms it's attested in are those oral preaching forms that we expect Jesus spoke in. And it would explain why Jesus was crucified. Even if Jesus wasn't advocating armed rebellion, if he had an alternative vision of what the rule of God on earth would look like, that would be a threat to Rome. It needn't be violent overthrow. He needn't have been a zealot. to have been perceived as preaching something threatening to the vision Rome had just drafted for the Mediterranean world. This view is consistent with earlier Jewish tradition, but one way it diverges as far as we know, we just haven't found all Jewish evidence, maybe there were some Jewish groups who did this, but he seems to expand the table to outsiders. And here I think is one, if you will, of the more damning things for Aslan's thesis. The people invited to this table that Jesus hosts as the symbol of the kingdom of God, this alternative to Rome, include Roman tax collectors. If they're the enemies you're not consorting with, if they're the ones you want to overthrow, why are you inviting them to your table? This is so odd that most historical Jesus scholars think it probably is true. We often hear about the sinners too, prostitutes and others. But tax collectors would signal an openness to the Romans and their collaborators that doesn't cohere with a picture of Jesus as the enemy of Rome. So however we draw Jesus' political nature, it can't be just outright black and white apocalyptic style rebellion against Rome, because it doesn't fit some of the stuff that scholars judge to be pretty historical. I'll skip that, because I just want to mention one last thing to give you a little more food for thought. I've mentioned that Jesus is called Son of God, and that is a counterpoint to what Rome was saying about its emperor. But there are other words that come up throughout the Gospels that echo Roman political theology. And I just want to introduce a few of them so you can hear that the Gospels do start to sound more political when we're aware of what the Romans were saying. When Jesus calls God Father, obviously that's a long-standing tradition in Judaism, but at the very moment Jesus was living, the Roman emperor was starting to call himself Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. The one governing the Roman Empire as a father governs his family. There's a vision implied in that of who the right father is. So when Jesus is made to say things about his father, we have a counterpoint, a political alternative being suggested. And it becomes more compelling as we see all the other words that are being used, drawn right out of political theology. In Luke's gospel, a favorite term for Jesus is soter. The Greek is used frequently in the eastern provinces for what the Roman emperor has to offer. He's saving the people. That very term is used as his title. The gospel itself, the good news, when the Romans would announce anything that the emperor had done, a new aqueduct, or he had brought peace to the empire, it was the good news. That's what it was called. In Greek, euangelion, it's the word that our evangelists use for the news of Jesus. It's a political term. Obviously, the term kingdom of God, basileo tou theou, I misspelt that. And then finally, another political moment. And this one, we're not as sure whether Jesus actually did it or whether our gospel authors are accentuating it. But when Jesus picks 12 of his followers to sort of continue the movement after his death, it's symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel, and therefore symbolic of an alternative government. So again, we're not sure if Jesus himself, if that traces to him, but we certainly can tell that the gospel authors who use all of this vocabulary are very consciously portraying Jesus as a political alternative to Rome. And that's the case after Jesus' death. They're making him more political than perhaps Jesus himself even was. Just some food for thought, things for you to chew on. I know that your custom is to move into small groups to kind of talk about some of the discussion questions. So I'll leave that to you.
I think a round of applause.